Hello and happy February 2026. Happy Black History Month. My name is Chrissy Thornton with Associated Black Charities, and I'm so excited to host you this afternoon for our Lunch and Learn webinar for Equity at Work. This is a series that's near and dear to my heart as we host both Black professionals and corporate professionals and our white allies who want to learn to be more inclusive around topics that are pressing for Black professionals at this time. Today's topic is supporting Black lives until it impacts the budget. And so we know that organizations release commitments. In fact, after 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, many organizations made very direct commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They changed their value statements on their websites, and many of them even hired or made provision for equity professionals to work at their organizations. They began to affirm, at least we thought, that Black lives mattered. But when the headlines began to fade and when budgets became finalized, the truth often began to emerge because budgets, in this sense, were not just financial documents, they were moral documents. They represented the investment in the work, the willingness to invest and sustain the work over time. And here we are in 2026, after 2025's presidential executive orders gave leeway and emboldenment to roll back progress. And we're seeing companies and organizations roll back progress as well. Many of them had already done so, having not been able to sustain the investment in equity work. Too often, equity is embraced in language but abandoned in allocation. Programs serving Black communities are often underfunded, delayed, or deprioritized, while institutions maintain the appearance of a commitment without making the structural investments required for real change. We've seen programmatic rollback. We've seen positions become eliminated and the role, even if it has been a sustained commitment, rolled into regular HR or community relationship work. We've seen a defunding of equity and inclusion. And when equity does not show up in the budget, that means it is not embedded in the system. I'm so excited today to moderate today's Equity at Work panel, and I would love to welcome our guest panelists on the screen with me at this time. Wonderful. I'm so excited to have two very esteemed colleagues and guests on ABC's Equity at Work today. And I'm going to ask that each of you come off mute and introduce yourselves and also tell us a little bit about why this topic is so important for you to participate in today's conversation. And we'll start with you, Linda.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm a political economist that looks at things through a spatial lens, being a GISP, a Geographical Information Systems professional. And with that, um, budgets are, as Chrissy already has said, they're this moral document, but they're also a spatial one. And so I'm excited to be able to delve a little bit more into this to talk about some of the things that I see that are kind of adverse for us and bring to light maybe some realities that we try to push down. So.
Thank you so much. And Diedrich.
Great. My name is Diedrich Asante Mohammed. I'm president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. The Joint Center was founded in 1970, and our mission is to provide actionable, evidence-based policy solutions to eradicate persistent barriers to the full freedom of Black people. As a DC-based think tank focused on the political economy of Black people, we see what's essential to supporting Black lives is to develop analysis of how policy affects Black people, and in particular, whether policy is helping to bridge, maintain, or worsen racial inequality. And an example of that is we just put out a report, State of the Dream 2026, From Regression to Signs of Black Recession, looking at the policy changes that were made in 2025 and doing some analysis as to how it's affected Black people and how we seem to be moving toward a recessionary period economically for Black people.
Mm-hmm. So I want to make a statement and then get both of you to kind of weigh in with your insight. We know that organizations can often speak about equity as a priority, but the budgets, the money, the investment reveal what is actually prioritized in an organization. ABC lost 23 corporate sponsors last year in 2025 after the executive orders, most of whom didn't even bother to give us the courtesy of a conversation about defunding the work. When funding decisions do not align with stated organizational commitments, equity becomes symbolic rather than systemic. So the real question is not what we say we value, but what we're willing to fund. When you hear that, what comes to mind?
Well, who's important in our lives? Who and what types of people are become important? Because if there's if there is some proximity of importance, then it becomes, all right, I need to take care of this, or I need to make sure that, we're talking about organizations funding other organizations, then yes, you see them as important. And I think as we've moved through the past few years, importance when it comes to Black folks has diminished. And so therefore, why bother, kind of a thing. So I think that's one of the things that's happening, that we have the importance of us has been diminished.
Dietrich?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, I've been at Joint Center for the last few years. I've worked at the NAACP, Prosperity Now, different nonprofits. And, when I was at the NAACP, we were doing analysis around kind of corporate racial equity. And, one thing I would get to a lot is focusing on what are the changes? What are the results you're looking to move forward? People sometimes will confuse, well, we're going to have a racial equity office as the step forward that we need. And, and they would say, well, and our racial equity office has 10 people. I'm like, that's fine. But if your employment practices haven't changed, if the amount of African Americans you have in higher level positions or throughout the organization, or your procurement hasn't changed, then that is of, to me, very little significance, right? If you can substantially move forward your procurement and have one person in your racial equity office, that's fine. Like, the main point is, how are you changing your investments and your practices, not having a space that you call equity, and then celebrating that. And I think, and today we're kind of at a different space where we were having some success in having a lot of things called racial equity a couple years ago, and now we've seen even those offices' names removed, and we're seeing that the quote unquote commitment to these issues was not serious, was not there, and has kind of caused a whiplash, I think, for many organizations.
And I love that you talked about real structural change within organizations, because even giving to community-based organizations, nonprofits that do the work is not the same as affecting structural change within the organization, which really requires a shift of power. And
Well,
so, yeah, tell us more
well,
about that.
and with that, I mean, when I was looking at how we're grading organizations on their Black inclusion, at one point there used to be a grade if they gave money to Black charitable groups, and I was like, that's a different thing. There's and they should, like,
Got to do both.
if you have a foundation, you should give if, as I say, it's a national foundation, you should give 13% of your foundational money to Black organizations. But but you might give 20%. But if your procurement is not even 1%, meaning your contracts with other businesses to Black businesses, not even 1%, well, you're still greatly failing there. Or if your representation of Black personnel is only at 5%, you're still greatly failing there. So, I think it's also always important to focus in on what aspect of racial equity are we going to talk about, because people talk about it so broadly. But you can be doing well in one area and horrible in another. Doesn't mean that one area is doing well and isn't important. but it means, okay, well, let's also look at the areas where there needs to be work. And usually people aren't doing well throughout all of the areas, usually.
So when we look at what happened in response to 2020's tragedy and organizations stepping up and, stating commitment, it was very responsive. But what was the business case to do the right thing? And is that part of the reason why those investments weren't sustained? Because they didn't see financial returns on those investments? Were they set up that way to bring economic return to organizations, or was this just all really charitable work?
Well, I would say that there was a part of it was charity, but it was like they wanted a public acknowledgement of like, look what I'm doing out here for this, without really paying attention to where is this within our line item, but for the budget. Have we really put a place in there to make sure that as the company does its ups and downs, that line item stays in focus? Because there may be no long-term funding mechanism that's there, or they never maybe didn't even think about putting a long-term mechanism there for the structure that they're saying they want equity, racial equity, because it was at the time kind of the popular thing to do. Like, and so, oh, look at me kind of thing with organizations. So I think that was going on a lot, and not having that long-term operating funds in their thinking of making sure it was there was missing.
Yeah, one thing I saw that concerned me is that what I saw some national corporations, financial institutions do is they had a certain amount of community development money. And let's say they had $10 million community development money. Then after, the murder of George Floyd, they would say, and we have this $10 million racial equity fund. And I was like, well, but that's the exact same money that you had before. And if you look at how it's being spent, it's not all being focused on racial equity or focused on the African American community. It's still the broad thing that you were doing. And that's still a very small amount of your overall profits that you're making. So some of it was just, kind of branding, naming the popular thing of the moment is racial equity and, what companies are doing for, I think some organizations did make some changes and did make some attempts at strengthening their maybe inclusion, the Black inclusion, or maybe some of their procurement dollars. But as was seen even before the Trump administration's come in, after a year or two, you already were seeing cuts in those initiatives. And I think that's if we're really trying to address these issues, it's going to have to be a long-term commitment to deal with these issues. It's not a 1 or 2 year kind of award giving. It has to be, long-term, because the racial wealth inequality is so substantial in kind of every aspect.
And we know it's going to take as long to dismantle some of this as it did to build it, unfortunately. My question is, what expectations should we have of organizations and companies? I mean, when we live in a society where there are stark public investment gaps for Black communities, for Black people, in schools, in infrastructure, healthcare, and we are experiencing more environmental hazards, more unemployment, just very, very much economically disinvested as a whole community. Should we expect companies to invest in our well-being? Was that an expectation that was reasonable? Often, and people know from this series that I've not been the biggest fan of ERGs because it places responsibility, I believe, on individual champions instead of institutional commitment and structural change. Should we even expect this kind of investment in our safety, in our support, in our well-being, or should there be another way for us to look at this?
When Chrissy, as you say that, I'm not going to answer that specifically, but because it conjures up another question for me. Did we, become so happy that, oh, they finally want us to be a part? And with that, were we mesmerized in it to some extent to the fact that, oh, we're now going to do these changes without really understanding how a company is working and what kinds of monies they have. As an economist, I was just teaching, the business cycle. The business cycle, there is these ups and downs, and did we just come in with rose-colored glasses because, oh, they're finally going to allow us to be a part of this, and finally it's going to be a good for us, without understanding that there's money associated with this. There's that budget for line item for it, and how long is it going to last? None of that, I don't think, was a part of our initial, and I'm going to use this word, happiness of finally being let in the door, in many instances anyway.
Yeah, because many of these roles that were created to be, the conduits of equity work in corporations, these DEI roles, they were filled by marginalized people. I don't know that Black people necessarily comprehensively benefited from DEI as an institution, but they were filled by people. And sometimes I think we do get mesmerized by one or two of us having access and opportunity and forget about the need to consider whole communities. What do you think, Diedrich?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always important to center yourself in, I'll say, kind of with quantitative analysis. I've got into racial economic inequality because I was looking at ways of trying to have a clear understanding of how we're making progress. And I thought that it seemed to be a clear way of understanding progress. And, I did a report not too long ago with Algernon Austin from the Center for Economic Policy Research. I forget the title, something like, the best Black economy in generations and why it isn't enough. And it was noting that, Black income was at a high, Black wealth was at a high, a couple other things. But even at that space, it was just a few years ago, it would still take, I think it was about 500 years for Blacks to get to the same income level as whites if we look at what's happened from 1960s to
And that's
that
with
point
intervention.
today.
That's
And
with that intervention.
Yeah, and and so that's the path we were on, and it was, I think, over 800 years in terms of wealth. So even with, kind of things being at all times high, we were at a remarkably slow pace. And so kind of being grounded in that helps me when I'm talking to a corporation or institution, what are my expectations? And generally my expectations are for you to at least invest in us as much as you invest in other communities, and for you to do what you say you're going to do, right? Like I've worked with corporations, like, look, we're not dealing with internal personnel. We're just going to deal with procurement. Okay, cool. So let's do procurement. Like your procurement level is 0.5%. Blacks are 13% of the population. How are we moving that forward? And what's the 5-10 year plan so we can see some substantive results? And so those are two things I try to look at is, making sure, holding institutions accountable for investing in us as they invest in others, and to follow the word that they have put forward or the efforts they're saying they are trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So I love this comment in the chat. It says, the insight you all have is of those who understand the real work beneath the surface. Not everyone placed in leadership of those initiatives and DEI efforts you're addressing held a personal or scholarly understanding, let alone a passion for truth and justice. I always ask the same question. Power concedes nothing without a demand. What benefit is it to those in power and those with influence and access to care about Black lives?
Yeah. I keep, my mind keeps going back to this one thing, Chrissy. We have to face that we have a racist society, and that there are mental things within people that will hold back a full commitment, a full outflowing, a full acceptance, a full belonging. And so with that in mind, we're always going to be at these like roadblocks, maybe a little bit of a turn, and maybe that's why it's 500 years or 800 years before wealth equality is there, because we have to admit, how do we get rid of that racist idea that someone with a deeper tone of skin tone is beneath somebody else? How do we how do we go around that? No, well, not that we go around it, but how do we bring that really into our conversation when we're looking at equity? Like, why do we need equity? Why is this topic out here? Because there's something amiss within, our society that we're afraid to address, or I'm not sure. I'm not afraid.
Well, I think so many people are comfortable with it, right? Because establishing equity means dismantling existing power structures.
Mhm.
And I think that's, the truth. As we're talking about this, I feel myself getting very emotional about how I regard self-determination and how I get very frustrated with our being mesmerized. I love that word you used, with this saviorism from organizations and from other communities when I feel like we should be strategizing around what it means to prioritize our own lives in many ways. But I want to
Right. Okay.
shift
Well, actually,
go ahead, Dietrich.
yeah, if I could just jump in real quick, I do want to comment on the comment that was made
Mhm.
about not everyone placed in leadership of those initiatives and DEI efforts, whether they held a personal understanding. I'm less concerned about or support, but more the understanding of racial equity. I do find, most of the time in these corporations, they don't hire someone with the expertise in addressing racial economic inequality, employment inequality, whatever they're focused on, procurement inequality. They hire a Black staff person who, or maybe it's not a Black staff person, but maybe it's a person of color, whoever, inside the institution who might have, been working to move up in the organization. They see this as a way to move up in the organization. And even if they do have a personal interest, a personal desire to address these issues, they really don't know much on how to do that, and oftentimes will be shocked at the pushback they're going to get if they actually try
Yes,
to do the job
make change,
they've given
right?
them. I've talked to people over and over again, and they're like, but they told me I was here to do this, and now they're not letting me do anything. And it's like, yeah, this is this is the kind of understanding you have to have about how much organizations don't understand they're committed to the racial inequality of today. They're committed to the practices they have been doing. And you have to, find where are the weak points that you can make some substantive change. And it's just, one other thing, I like to, when I'm discussing these things, focus more so on this idea of, or the reality of white supremacy versus just racism, just to identify.
That's right.
Because to me, I'm identifying the problem is white supremacy. Whites are supreme in their economic concentration, their wealth concentration, these types of things. And if that's the problem, then we're going to break that up, right? Like I try to change people's racist ideas about Black people, not by changing their ideas in their head, but by changing the reality that maybe once Blacks are no longer economically in asset poverty, that people stop thinking them as being inferior. Like, let's make them not inferior in our societies. And I think that's going to be the most important way to make that shift.
So I'm glad you talked about substantive change. So let's talk about strategies that we can come up with and share to move organizations, hierarchies, governments to more investment in supporting Black lives. What does that look like? We talk about it theoretically, but what do those commitments really look like on a granular level?
Well, I can't help but to bring in my economic background, but there's these opportunity costs. If we don't, can we emphasize the opportunity costs that are being lost if we don't make those kinds of changes? If we don't make sure that everybody, can, maybe make more, that equity is there. And, and what is the externalities if you have some some disinvestments going on?
So we got to make a value proposition
Yeah.
for the work.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. That seems like a whole lot when I'm just surviving, what it means to be Black in America. That seems like a whole lot to put on my shoulders, but that is a strategy. We should be outlining the value proposition.
Right. If we're going to come up with something as a group, then, those who can put that out there, who have platforms for it, let's do it. Let's make sure that people are recognizing those opportunity costs that are lost, the externalities that happen when you don't invest. So anyway, those are
Good.
some ways to
Yeah.
go about it.
My strategy has been to focus, to engage those who are saying that they are committed to doing something, about these issues, right? Oftentimes corporations at different times will, say, okay, that somehow they got recognized, they got called out for something, and they will say that we are going to help address this issue. I usually wait to that point because because I think it is important to understand the power dynamics. It's like, but if you're doing the corporation, it's their corporation, and unless maybe, there's ideas of boycotts and these types of things, maybe this particular corporation is particularly dependent upon Black people or something like that. And if so, you can leverage that. But many corporations aren't particularly dependent on Black America. And so you don't have that power space. So it's more so, I guess the kind of the leverage I try to use is you made this commitment. And we are going to hold you to that commitment. And first, let me see, the ignorance is astounding oftentimes of people understanding the depth of racial inequality, and particularly racial economic inequality. Again, I've worked with financial institutions, and they oftentimes will talk about financial literacy. And I was saying one of the first aspects of financial literacy you need is a literacy and understanding of racial wealth inequality, the reality of that, what maintains that, and then what practices your financial institution can take to help address that. Not that your financial practices of even a large bank will solve that overall. But if you don't even understand the reality of racial wealth inequality, it's going to be hard for you to engage in financial practices that don't continue that reality. So again, I just kind of try to identify, what is the leverage point you have, and then build off of that, and then set for yourself attainable goals, understanding what leverage you have.
I'm going to move into 5 ways that employers, corporate leaders, companies, organizations can begin to align what they say their values are with supporting Black people and Black lives. But before we do that, I want to talk to you all about the power dynamics and what power our community does have. Many of us have been participating in Target boycott and other boycotts since last year, some people even before that. How does our cooperative economics and our spending power and our talent pool and our resources provide any pressure at all? Is it cumulative enough to provide pressure? We've seen some things happen at Target over the past year. How can we influence movement with our own behaviors and choices as a community?
Definitely with having these boycotts it's a representative of you're not happy with the company and what their decisions that they're making. But Chrissy, we have to understand that it's all together here. We've got government, businesses, and people all together, and we've got government doing stuff to businesses and doing stuff to people. How can we maybe influence then the government, and I would say it through voting and elections, to influence the businesses so that they then will be more receptive to the people. So I don't know that we can, or at least for me, I can't leave out government, because government is such a powerful thing when it comes to businesses. Look at what's happening with Netflix and Stardance, and I've forgotten all the different companies. Like, there is this control that's there, but who is the government? And the other thing, when we talk about work and equity, well, do you know how many Black folks have worked for government and have lost jobs? And so there is this influence, there is amount of folks who are in that government sector that I think we should also pay attention to and influence there, which then influences the businesses, which then precipitates to the people.
And to play devil's advocate, because I love that you took it there, because there is some responsibility of government for so many decades, our strategy was to get Black people into high-level positions so that they would advocate for Black communities. We wanted to have a Black mayor and a Black city council president and a Black governor and a Black president and all of these things. And here in Maryland, we're a blue state and we have that representation. But I start to feel now that representation was not the win, that action and activating, disproportionately for Black communities would have been the win. So I'll turn it to Dietrich. Any thoughts on that or the original question about our collective power?
Yeah, well, I'll just bring up too some of the data around federal government. I mean, I think one thing to look at is there's massive power in government. Look at what the Trump administration has done.
Mhm.
And people, and done it, outright, and has, cut maybe I think around 261,000 government positions, 261,000 less government positions now than there were a year ago due to the kind of pressure being put in the federal government. Economic Policy Institute, Valerie Wilson did an analysis, and she said of those 261,000, about 100,000, 95,000 were Black women who are no longer in federal government. And, like that's such a huge overrepresentation, and the ability to tack DEI within government, push people out of government, it looks like disproportionately Black people, and at the same time, hold the private sector and say, and you're going to end your DEI programs and push those out. And so it's really oftentimes the way government works is you get, when Democrats are in power, their people are in government, and then when they go out of power, they go into the private sector. But we're seeing with Black America that it's so much, part of the Democratic establishment. When they lost power in the federal government, particularly in the DC area, they had no private sector to go to. And there's just kind of like, again, it's not like the average African American or the poor person, but kind of the Black professional who's made it. You're seeing a lot more challenges there than you usually see, particularly at a time of historically fairly low unemployment. So I think, those are all interesting things. But I do think, it's clear that federal government, the government has much power. And I would say even mayors and things like that, there is some power there, but it's also limited. I think Maryland's an unusual place where oftentimes you have Black cities in the South where the state is so conservative and is so dominated that the mayor or the local official has
city,
such, little power. I think Maryland's an interesting place because we're not the majority at all, but the fact that we are in a Democratic state, and so we almost are half of the Democrats, that then allows for when you're in power to be able to do much more, and there's much more that needs to be done in Maryland, but just saying Maryland is the place where you probably have some of the strongest Black political electoral power in the country. Other places are it's much more challenging where you could have an all Black city, like in Mississippi or something like that, but the state will control everything, even your funding.
One of the comments said the sentiment is like, if I'm good, who cares about you? So, and that I think that's happening in not just white communities, but in Black communities. We talked about the fragility of some of the success that even Black people have attained now being in jeopardy. And another comment says that read that there were orders that blocked executive actions from the current administration aimed at limiting DEI. Do we think that'll change anything?
I mean, I like where it says, will this move the needle? It might move the needle, right? But I guess, one thing too, I always try to make sure I don't get caught up on is that, yes, the Trump administration has done some shock and awe tactics and some substantive things that have, pushed back many people who are trying to do some good things in government and has created some economic security for those in those spaces. But previous to that, Blacks still weren't, we weren't on the path to racial economic equality in any sphere, right? I know too, and I think in a State of a Dream report, 2025 is an interesting year because you have these kind of massive policy attacks, while at the same time, you have the largest amount of Black congressional representatives in the history of the United States, right? I think it was 61, 62 House of Representatives, I think 5 Black senators. And you also have record levels of Black mayors, Black state legislators. So I think one thing is always important to look at, okay, where do we have power? What type of power do we have? And then how can we utilize that? And again, power isn't only electoral office, right? Because you also need kind of grassroots organizing and these types of things. But figuring out, where can you leverage? What things can you do? What things can you implement? And again, I will note that if any past president would have embraced addressing racial economic inequality as it relates to Black people in the way that Trump has embraced anti-DEI efforts.
That's right.
We could have made some much more substantive progress than we have made, right? So I think that's also something that we need to have much further demands and make sure that who we're supporting might not win, but who we're supporting at least will say that they're
Is willing to take the
these
risk.
dramatic. That's right.
Yes, of supporting, because it'll take a disproportionate amount of attention paid to Black communities for us to even begin to move the needle at all. So the research shows there are 5 ways that employers, organizations, companies, and leaders can begin to align their stated value of equity with how they invest in it. And the first is to fund what you say you value, to ensure that commitments to equity are reflected in actual resource allocation. Any thoughts? Put your money where your mouth is. That's the layman's way of saying that.
Companies have to, and I'll go back to my opportunity costs, have to recognize what value they can get if they do the investment that's needed. Having the will to do it is a slippery slope, particularly when it comes to how much money we want to make sure our sponsors have, the fact our stocks, folks who how well our stock is going, all of these kinds of things, and what priorities can a company come up with, or should they come up with, to make sure that they're moving towards this goal of equity at work. I think it's a matter of saying that it has to be a long time thing. It can't be just for today and let's cross that, make that check mark on that. Where in our in our future, as we move as a company, is that going to be a line item budget in our budget, and making sure that it's long term. I think that's probably one of the most important things that a company should probably look at doing.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly say, to me, I just want clear quantitative goals. Like, what is your goal so we can figure out if we made it, right? Is your goal giving away $1 million to Black businesses? Okay, that's your goal. We can clearly measure that. Is it to strengthen Black entrepreneurship in your community? That's a different goal. How are we going to measure that, right? Is it having more Blacks in your workforce? Right? These are all clear, but to me, if you don't have a clear goal, then you can never really hold them accountable. And it all is just words, and they will use things like values to hide the lack of quantitative analysis that's able to be done on what they're doing. It's hard to measure I don't know, kind of verbal values. I want numbers. Yeah, that's right. I want objective goals that we can measure and then hold you accountable to.
But
the second,
one other thing, that if companies can understand that under investment in Black communities is not simply just an unjust thing, it's economically inefficient. And as economists and as businesses, they want to be moved towards efficiency. How efficient are we? And so are we going to do something that's inefficient? Well, it's inefficient if we're not paying attention to these communities where we could be producing dollars. So
absolutely. The second way is to embed equity in core operations. So this talks about making sure equity is part of the full strategy, not just some add-on program, that it's not treated as extra, that it's not funded through temporary grants or short-term initiatives, rather than embedded in the fabric of the organization and how it operates. What do you think? And it says because when equity is optional, it is also vulnerable.
Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, it is ideal if you can get an organization to say that this is an essential part of who we are and what we do, and we're going to measure it in every area, right? That is ideal, and it makes it, much easier because it's supposed to be central to the entire company. I think, you know, 95% of the time, that's not the case. It is at best a side project. But even then, I'll just try to hold them accountable. What is a side project? And what is the goal of that side project and how we're going to get it done? And two, I think, there's one thing about the big corporations you're trying to hold accountable, and then there's your organization, right? And like that is where you probably could have, this idea of essential to my organization, whatever it is, right? If you're some type of nonprofit, we do believe that racial economic inequality is the foundation of racial inequality, and we want to address that through our practice. And it doesn't mean you're going to change racial inequality all throughout necessarily Baltimore, but it means, hey, when we do business with other businesses, we're going to make sure that a certain percentage are Black businesses. We're going to, so at least in your circle, what you can control, you
Yeah.
can center
Yeah.
equity. So that's a place we can all start.
And I'm also very interested this year in 2026 in coalescing around the people who've done the defunding, right? Like, because many of those show up even for our organizations as a vendor or a business that, an entity with whom we do business. And we don't have to do business with organizations who don't see us, value us as people, and invest in our community. So I'm really excited. I mean, maybe my mid-sized nonprofits pulling business away from a major institution that doesn't support Black people won't make a difference, but 30 of us doing it will make a difference. And so it's also looking at how, as an ecosystem of organizations, community organizations, nonprofit organizations, we steward our support of businesses based on who supports us back. The next thing says support Black-led organizations, invest directly in leaders and organizations rooted in the communities they serve. And I'll just give the caveat. I always say this, that Black-led organization thing is a setup. When I led the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, it was Black-led. It did not disproportionately focus on Black lives. So you can't just be Black-led and have a person who is melanated in the seat. You have to be both Black-led and Black integrated, meaning that the work that you do predominantly impacts the Black community, and you have to have connectivity within the community. So what do we think about saying that organizations and companies and leaders who care about Black lives will support Black-led and Black integrated organizations?
Well, do we, I mean, I have a hard time believing that that would be actually the case. One is, and I just happened to see a pop up on the chat screen that education, how well are we educating ourselves? And I see this form right here as a way of educating us about gathering the knowledge. Oh, these kinds of things are out there. This issue is out there. I may need to rethink how I'm approaching this. And if we're having, these organizations that are led by a melanated person that aren't really pushing forward, then how do we know? How do we really even know it? What kinds of ways are we bringing in knowledge about all of us so that we can just, churn it and make sense of it to be able to say, okay, let's maybe address these people about what they're doing, how they're doing it. Or maybe we need to take just more interest in pushing and building little entities that are out there and helping them be stronger. But we can't do that if we don't really know about them. And so how do we then bring all of this knowledge of us together? So maybe that's something we need to think about. How do we bring the knowledge of us to us?
Yeah, and how do we sustain caring about learning? And so often I think where we get our news and information from matters. right? We're in this digital age where people are getting more news and education from TikTok than they are from trusted media sources or trusted educational environments. I asked someone just haphazardly the other day if they were following what was going on in the world with, the Epstein files and all, because it seems salacious, but it is things that's happening in the world we live in. And they were like, nope, because there's a fatigue around learning about our own oppression. And there's a fatigue around learning about some of these things that are happening. And then we opt to not learn at all and to just live a very singular, siloed life that's not really rooted in activism. Any thoughts, Dietrich?
Yeah, well, I just want to note, I do think that's an important distinction, Black-led institution or Black-led organizations and Black institutions, right? Those are different things. Because again, if I become head of whatever company, that doesn't mean all of a sudden that the company cares about racial wealth inequality and stuff like that. Because you have having a Black manager does not make your corporation
That's right.
a Black business, even if you're the president, because
That's right.
you are being told what to do by the board, by the mission of the organization, these types of things. So I think we should have a focus. I am for supporting Black institutions. And again, not all Black institutions are great, but nonetheless, as a whole, I'm supporting Black institutions that have a commitment and history of working to advance, Black people, those things. And again, I think, you can be a Black leader at a white organization that might not be able to move much, but I would reach out to that Black leader and try to bring in other Black leaders of organizations and have conversations. Hey, what can you do in your space? Or what ways can you support these types of things? But again, I think it's a very important distinction. Just because you have a Black president of a white corporation does not make that white corporation now a Black liberation organization, right? It has nothing to do, probably, I'm sure that's not in their job description. And so they will not be able to focus on that as you might expect.
And sometimes I think it's very predatory to choose Black faces to sit in seats of perceived power, knowing that they're not liberation-minded Black people too. And I know we don't like to say that out loud, but I just want to throw that in.
And oftentimes too, they can move the least because they are being so watched, and are kind of in such a precarious position that, to have these, great expectations of them, I think is, historically not well deserved.
So real quick, I'm going to do the last two, and then I'm going to go to the question in the chat. It says commit to multi-year funding, which we've already talked about, lengthening time of investment. And then it says companies, employers, leaders, organizations have to be transparent about trade-offs, because often if you want to make an effort to fund equity work, it requires reallocation. And then there's this perception that something must get less so that this can get more. So leaders will need to be prepared to explain those reallocations or changes. Any thoughts on that really quick?
You just explain opportunity costs to us when you said that. So what are you giving up if you're giving more to this, or what are you getting more of when you make those decisions? And how do we put that into corporations' mind? How do we instill that or that kind of knowledge or that understanding to do that? Because I mean, that's the way to go about it. If they could realize, if they're investing more in people who haven't maybe had as much, that's going to bring up the wholeness of everyone.
Right. That's economic mobility. Moving people through, different asset classes helps everyone. It repairs the economic market for everyone. It creates better dynamics and outcomes for the company for everyone. Go ahead, DJ.
But just noting, a lot of corporations don't care about everyone. Right?
That's right.
I remember, like, a head of one of the most prominent banks was like, if you don't have $300,000 in your banking account, you're really just a liability to me. And I was like, well, at least he's being honest. You know what I mean? Like, he don't really
right.
care. And most people don't have $300,000, obviously, in their bank account. So it's just like, who are they serving? What are their interests? And I think we all need to even be real with ourselves about, because I think, like, we want to believe that everything is for us, and everything's for everybody, and people want to help. No, a lot of the corporations are out here just to make profit. They don't really care about you or about your community. There might be levers that you can utilize to get them to do some investments or what have you, but we have to kind of we have to be realist as well, not just optimist.
So I love this. I want to ask this question in the chat and then we'll move into a little bit of our wind down. It says, do we, Black United States citizens, have enough capital to realistically fund our own institutions so we're not so dependent upon the white power structure?
At the moment, no. But can we, you know what, what's come to my mind is how do we make those who have all the money or have more money understand that they got their money a certain way and maybe it came through the likes of me or my, heritage or my folks. And can you then like make a little spin in your mind and come back to a reality that is inclusive of us? Can we then make sure that we have the money so that we can build our own? Because if we had the money, we can build. And you see many instances where Black folks are building, and particularly some of these young folks, they're coming up with some creative ideas in building. And thank goodness we don't have to build with stuff anymore. It can be ideas and on in the internet of things and that sort of stuff. So our building, is fluid right now. If we can just harness the fact that we need to have a little more monies coming into us.
So I'll just put out, last time I looked at this, Black Americans had about $2 trillion of wealth. America had a whole, for individuals, put together, had about $90 trillion of wealth. So African Americans had only about 3% of the wealth of the nation, right? We need the 10 trillion to get our proportional representation. So there's that. We have enough money to build institutions, but you can't expect, our current economy is based off of, right? Like you said, we talk about a history of white supremacy, of taking people, of taking land, of neo-colonizing other areas, forcing them to give business deals. So if the question is, can we live like the robber, right? Like, no, with our meager funds, can we, if we're willing to live a more maybe materialistically humble lifestyle, but in many ways more healthy, more engaged
More
community,
ownership.
yes, we could create institutions. But if you think our institutions are gonna have the same type of material wealth as institutions that are based off of robbery and exploitation, no, unless you just want, and I think that's an important question. Are we trying to just be more part of the white supremacist institutions, power structures, and the great wealth? Or are we trying to create something separate, which means we're going to live differently? Those are things we have to wrestle with, and then you can measure appropriately.
I always repeat a quote from Davon Love at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, where he said that some people want to build better plantations while others want true liberation. And I think that really is a question.
Or integrated plantations, or
Integrated.
plantations that are run by a Black person, right?
Yeah,
Like, do you
right,
want to end
right.
slavery, or do you want a non-racialized slavery?
Right.
What do you want?
And it's so interesting because until our community can reconcile on whether inclusion means proximity to whiteness, and that's what we value, whether we're waiting for a form of saviorism for communities that have traditionally not cared about us, or whether through our cooperation and collaborative work together, we can start to build within our own community, more economic power and influence. Those are things that are going to have to be poured into the strategy of it all. But first, I want to thank the both of you for joining us. An hour never seems like it's long enough, and I want to give you the opportunity to give some closing remarks to our guests. So Linda, we'll start with you and then go to Diedrich.
Well, so this has been a wonderful conversation. And I'll kind of go back to that first thing. Budgets are a moral document, but they're also spatial documents, because where within our country, where are we going to make sure that we're making sure that folks are having what is needed, and that they're able to grow, that they're able to move through their own destiny the way that they choose to do. And I think that becomes a big part of where and what we need to be thinking about how healthy are we as we do that? What kinds of things are necessary? And that DEI thing, I think it's like let's just understand that it was an experiment maybe. And let's make sure that we can maybe grasp a trueness of a folks' budget that will help accelerate us in a very positive way.
All right, Dietrich. And I want to point out the comment in the chat before you give your closing remarks about other communities who've coalesced around economic power.
Sure. Well, first, just note, we all have, small but important roles to play. We at the Joint Center for Political Economic Studies, we are trying to focus on usually national policy, but sometimes local policy analysis, how policy affects Black people. If you want an organization that has a long history of doing this, please check out our website, check out our report, State of the Dream 2026, to highlight, what have been the challenges, last year in policy change. The things put below, about 3% of U.S. Indian Americans own 60% of all hotels, these types of things. Yes, I think, it is true that, but let's look at that example. That is actually usually the poor, more working class Indian population that came in and took the kind of cheap, poor motels and started working those, where you would kind of work 24 hours a day, bring in your family, and they were working class Indians, and they were willing to come here because the living standards could be higher, and would be willing to put in 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and have a poor part of the economy that Hilton didn't want, the big hotels don't want. So yes, there's example there, but there's also some truth there, right? The Indian Americans who are some of the have the highest income in the United States for kind of a subracial group. That's not them. Those are the ones that are coming in with engineering degrees and were working for whatever, different tech companies and these types of things. So just want to note, yes, there's places in the market that we can come together and take over. But again, that's not glamorous. It's not necessarily incredibly wealth producing, but it could provide, it is wealth producing in the sense that you could control assets. It just might not be the same type of rich material life you would expect, and it takes kind of years of work and dedication. So I think there's a lot in that example that we could learn from, but maybe not what people expect.
Thank you so much to both of you for participating today. We appreciate your insight and your expertise. And as always, thank you all for joining us for Equity at Work. We'll be back in April, where our Equity at Work topic is how professionalism polices Black men, right? So we're looking at concepts around professionalism and how it keeps Black men out of opportunity. For Associated Black Charities, I am Chrissy Thornton. Have a great rest of your day.